A 7-year-old girl sat perfectly still at the end of a long banquet table, her small hands folded in her lap, watching a room full of adults. She had never met laugh at jokes she didn't understand. There was a cake in front of her, 3 tiers, white fondant, her name written in gold cursive across the middle tier. And it had been sitting there uncut for 43 minutes. Nobody had asked if she was ready, nobody had noticed she wasn't. Her name was Rosie. And the woman across the room who kept glancing at her phone between handshakes was her grandmother, Beverly Holloway, one of the most respected family court judges in British Columbia. This is not a story about a bad grandmother, it's more uncomfortable than that. Beverly Holloway had spent 31 years on the bench. She had ruled on hundreds of custody cases, termination hearings, adoption proceedings. She understood, in an intellectual and legal sense, what children needed. She could cite the research. She had written opinions quoting it. In a courtroom, her instinct for a child's emotional well-being was considered among the sharpest in the province. Lawyers prepared differently when Beverly was presiding. They knew she would ask the questions nobody else bothered to ask. But understanding something professionally and living it personally are two different things. And Beverly Holloway, for all her courtroom clarity, had a blind spot the size of a ballroom when it came to her own granddaughter. Rosie's mother, Caitlin, had died 22 months earlier. An aggressive form of brain cancer, diagnosed in March, gone by November. She was 34 years old. She left behind a husband named Liam Sutherland, a 7-year-old daughter, and a grief so specific and so total that it had reorganized every room in their small house in Burnaby, without moving a single piece of furniture. Liam had not fallen apart. That was what people kept telling him, as though it were a compliment. "You haven't fallen apart." He smiled and said thank you, and went home and sat at the kitchen table, after Rosie was asleep, and stared at the wall for a while, before doing it all again the next morning. He drove a school bus for the Vancouver School District, Monday through Friday. He coached Rosie's soccer team on Saturday mornings. He made her lunch every night before bed so mornings would be easier. He was not falling apart. He was just very, very tired, in a way that sleep didn't fix. Beverly had organized Rosie's birthday party at the Holloway family estate in West Vancouver. A sprawling property with a view of the inlet, a catered lunch, a string quartet that Beverly had hired because Caitlin used to love classical music, and Beverly thought this was a meaningful tribute. The guest list had grown, as Beverly's guest lists tended to do. What started as a small family gathering had expanded to include 3 of Beverly's former law clerks, 2 sitting judges she considered close friends, the couple who ran the family foundation, and a professor from UBCC who had co-authored a paper with Beverly and happened to be in town. Liam had raised a quiet concern about this the week before. "Rosie doesn't really know those people," he said. Beverly had nodded, and said it would be fine, that children adapt, that it was important for Rosie to feel surrounded by people who loved her family. Liam had not pushed back hard enough. He knew that about himself later. He had been too tired, and Beverly was too certain, and he had told himself it would be fine. It was not fine. Rosie had arrived in a yellow dress. Liam had let her pick herself. She had been excited on the drive over, asking whether the cake would have sprinkles, whether her cousin Theo would be there, whether they could play in the garden after. Liam had said yes to all 3, not knowing that Theo had come down with a cold and wouldn't make it, that the garden was roped off because Beverly's groundskeeper had just reseeded the lawn, and that the cake, while beautiful, had no sprinkles. By the time the adults were deep into their 3rd round of conversation, Rosie had retreated to her chair at the end of the table, and gone quiet in the way children go quiet when they have decided that no one is coming. She wasn't crying. That was almost harder to watch. She had stopped expecting anything, and so she had stopped wanting anything, and she sat with her hands in her lap, and her eyes on the cake, and her face completely still. Liam was across the room. He had been pulled into a conversation with one of Beverly's former clerks, a well-meaning man named Arthur, who wanted to talk about the transit referendum, and kept using the phrase, "as a commuter yourself." Liam kept glancing toward Rosie. Each time he told himself she was fine, she was just being quiet. Kids sometimes go quiet. Then he'd look again, and she'd be in the exact same position, untouched cake in front of her, nobody beside her, and something in his chest would tighten, and he'd look away again, because he didn't know how to fix it without making a scene, and making a scene at Beverly's house felt like a category of impossible. He was wrong about that, but he didn't know it yet. The man who noticed Rosie first was not a lawyer or a judge or anyone with a credential that would have impressed Beverly Holloway at all. His name was Calvin Broussard, and he was 41 years old, and he was there because his daughter, Maisie, had been in Rosie's kindergarten class 2 years earlier, and the two girls had been close enough that Beverly had included them on the list. Calvin ran a small landscaping company in Coquitlam. His wife had passed 4 years ago, a car accident on the Coquitlam connector, a wet October night. He had been raising Maisie alone since she was 3. He knew what alone looked like on a child's face. He had seen it on Maisie's face in the months after her mother died. That particular stillness that isn't peace, that particular quiet that isn't contentment. The look of a child who has learned not to ask for what they need, because asking had stopped producing results. Calvin was standing near the drinks table when he spotted Rosie at the end of the banquet table. He watched her for a moment. He looked around the room to see if anyone else had noticed. Nobody had. Beverly was mid-sentence about something, gesturing with her wine glass. Liam was nodding at Arthur with the expression of a man doing long division in his head. Calvin set down his glass and said quietly to Maisie, who was standing beside him, eating a small plate of crackers, "Hey bud, you want to go sit with Rosie?" Maisie looked over at Rosie and then back at her dad. "She looks sad." Calvin said, "She does." They walked over together. Calvin pulled out the chair beside Rosie and sat down without ceremony, and Maisie climbed into the chair on Rosie's other side and immediately said, "I like your dress, yellow is my favorite." Rosie looked at her, then at Calvin, then back at Maisie. "It's my birthday," she said as though she wasn't entirely sure anyone knew. "I know," Maisie said, "that's why we came." Something shifted in Rosie's face. Not a full smile yet, but the beginning of one, the pre-smile, the one that means the door is opening. Calvin leaned forward on his elbows and looked at the cake. "3 tiers," he said. "That's serious." "What flavor?" "Lemon," Rosie said. "With raspberry in the middle." "Okay, that's actually my favorite combination on earth." "I'm not even saying that. Ask Maze, it's true," Maisie said. "He says it every time we drive past that bakery on Austin." Rosie almost smiled again. "We haven't cut it yet," she said. "Nobody asked." Calvin glanced toward the rest of the room. Beverly was still talking. The caterers were moving quietly along the edges of the space. Liam had his back to them now. "Well," Calvin said, "it's your birthday, you could just decide it's time." Rosie looked at the cake, then at him. "Can we?" "It's your cake," he said simply. "You're the one who gets to say when." That was the moment Liam finally turned around. He had excused himself from Arthur mid-sentence. Something about the referendum had jogged a memory of needing to check on Rosie, and when he turned, he saw his daughter sitting between a man he barely knew and a small girl in pigtails, and Rosie was laughing. Actually laughing, the kind that comes from somewhere real, the full-body kind that makes a 7-year-old's shoulders shake. Liam stood still for a moment. The tightness in his chest that had been there for the last hour shifted into something different. Not relief exactly, more like recognition, like seeing something he had almost missed. He walked over slowly. Calvin looked up and gave a small nod, not the deferential nod of someone worried about overstepping, just the easy acknowledgement of one parent recognizing another. Liam sat down on the other side of the table. "Hey Bug," he said. "You doing okay?" "Calvin says I can decide when we cut the cake," Rosie said. Liam looked at Calvin. Calvin gave the smallest shrug, the kind that said, "It's just the truth." "He's right," Liam said. "It's your birthday." Rosie turned to the cake. She looked at it for a moment with the focused consideration of someone making a genuinely important decision. Then she said, "Now, I want to do it now." What happened next was small and entirely ordinary, and also, if you had been standing in that room watching it, somehow the most real thing that had happened all afternoon. Calvin caught the attention of one of the caterers. Maisie scooted her chair closer to Rosie's. Liam put his hand on Rosie's shoulder. The cake was brought forward. A candle was lit, just one, because Rosie said she wanted to practice wishing. The adults in the rest of the room gradually went quiet, and drifted over, not because anyone asked them to, but because something was happening at the end of the table, and it was pulling at them, without their full understanding of why. Beverly Holloway stood at the edge of the gathering, and watched her granddaughter close her eyes, over a single candle, and, for the first time all afternoon, she stopped thinking about what the event looked like, and started feeling what it actually was. When Rosie's blew out the candle, everyone clapped. Maisie cheered loudly, and Rosie turned to her and laughed again, and that sound filled the room differently than any of the adult conversation had managed to do for the previous 2 hours. The cake was lemon and raspberry, and it was by several accounts extraordinary. Later that evening, after most guests had gone, Beverly found Liam in the kitchen, helping the caterers stack serving platters. She stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him work. Rosie had fallen asleep on the sitting room sofa, with Maisie curled up beside her, both of them exhausted in the boneless, fully committed way of children. "Liam," Beverly said. He turned. She had been composing something in her head for the past hour, an explanation of why the party had taken the shape it had, a defense of her intentions, a recounting of everything she had organized and arranged and provided. She had the argument ready. It was a good argument. She had been making good arguments for 31 years. She didn't make it. Instead she said, "I didn't see her." Liam looked at her. "I kept looking at her from across the room," Beverly said. "I thought that counted. I thought if I could see her, I was paying attention." She stopped. "I wasn't paying attention." Liam set down the platter he was holding. She sat at that table for 40 minutes, Beverly said. At her own birthday, and I was 10 meters away talking about the endowment fund." There was a long silence. The caterers, to their credit, had quietly found reasons to be somewhere else. "She's okay," Liam said finally. "She had a good time in the end, because of that man," Beverly said. "Calvin, not because of anything I arranged." Liam didn't argue with that. It was true, and Beverly was not someone who was well served by comfortable untruths. "He lost his wife too," Liam said quietly, 4 years ago. "He knows what it looks like." Beverly absorbed this. "I know what it looks like," she said. "Professionally, I know exactly what it looks like. I've cited the literature on childhood grief responses in 4 separate written decisions." She shook her head, "And I couldn't see it in my own granddaughter." Liam was quiet for a moment, then he said, "There's knowing it and there's being present for it. They're not the same thing." That sentence stayed with Beverly in the way that true things do, not comfortably, but durably. She thought about it on the drive home. She thought about it the following week, when she called Liam, and asked if she could take Rosie to the science center, just the two of them, no agenda, no other guests. She thought about it when Rosie took her hand in the planetarium, and leaned against her arm in the dark and said, very quietly, "Grandma, do you think my mom can see the stars from where she is?" Beverly had no juridical answer for that. She had no precedent to cite. She put her arm around her granddaughter and said, "I think she can see everything," and meant it completely. In the months that followed, things changed. Not all at once, not in ways that would make headlines, but in the steady, cumulative manner of someone who has genuinely recalibrated. Beverly reduced her commitments on weekends. She started coming to Rosie's soccer games, arriving early enough to get a good spot on the sideline. She and Liam developed a routine, Sunday dinners at the Burnaby house, where Beverly would sit at the kitchen table while Liam cooked, and Rosie did her homework at the other end of the table, and it wasn't elegant, or catered or impressive, in any external sense, and Beverly found she preferred it to almost anything else in her week. She also quietly began reviewing her court's law protocol for how family events were conducted during custody and access proceedings. Specifically, how often child-centered needs got administratively flattened by adult logistics. She raised the issue at a judicial council meeting in January. It generated more conversation than she had expected. It was a start. Calvin and Liam became, over time, the kind of friends that form specifically between people who share a particular weight. Not dramatic friendship, not the kind that makes for good stories, just the kind where you text about minor things, and occasionally sit in someone's backyard, on a Tuesday evening, while the kids run through a sprinkler, and neither person feels the need to explain why it's good to be there. Maisie and Rosie stayed close in the way of children who found each other at the right moment. Which is to say, they fought sometimes, and made up immediately, and told each other things they didn't tell other people. Rosie's next birthday was at the Burnaby house. Liam made her favorite meal, butter chicken from a recipe Caitlin had written out on an index card that was now laminated and kept in the kitchen drawer. Beverly came early, and helped hang streamers. Calvin and Maisie brought a homemade cake, chocolate with vanilla frosting, slightly lopsided, decorated with gel icing, that spelled Rosie in letters of variable height. Rosie declared it the best cake she had ever seen. She was not performing, she meant it. When they sang Happy Birthday, she sat in the middle of the table, with people she loved on all sides of her, and she closed her eyes over 8 candles, with the total seriousness of someone for whom wishing still meant something. She had not sat alone at that table for a single moment. She did not have to wonder if anyone was coming. There is research, and Beverly could cite it, though she no longer needed to, because she had lived it, showing that children who experience significant loss are most resilient, not in the presence of resources or structured interventions, but in the presence of consistent, attentive human connection. Not perfect connection, not elaborate connection, just someone who notices and stays. It costs nothing. It requires only the willingness to cross a room. Somewhere in a room like that right now, there is probably a child sitting very still, waiting to see whether anyone will come. The question is never whether the child needs it. The question is only whether someone will notice in time. Calvin Broussard noticed, and everything that came after, the laughter, the laminated recipe cards, the lopsided cake, the grandmother, who finally learned to show up before she was needed. All of it began with a man who set down his x and walked across a room because a little girl looked like she had stopped expecting anything, and he remembered what that felt like, and he decided that today at least, it didn't have to end that way.